around the internet. I'll start with Stefano De Zapata, who's from the Oxford Internet Institute. I specifically asked Stefano to join the panel because I found that the Oxford Internet Institute does great work around visualization. And they do a lot of interesting work on capturing data and putting it out there so that people can understand in sort of snapshot what's really happening. And I wanted him to share that with us and how they do it and the type of work they do. Professor Masingi from Mozambique. He represents, I would say, the policymaker's perspective here. Formerly Minister of Science and Technology in Mozambique, and still involved with policy making through a think tank that he put together in Mozambique. And I would say that he is among the pioneer on the internet in Mozambique. Robert Vieira, who I said earlier that you have many hats, but he's in the University of Toronto, Citizens Lab at the Monk Center. But he's also, I would say, helping civil society organizations around the world to better understand how they can manage their information online, circumvent any type of censorship and surveillance, and so forth. So I wanted him to speak about that elements and topics. My friend and colleague, Yassin Khaledi, who is the Alliance for Affordable Internet, and the Alliance for Affordable Internet is involved on the second iteration or edition. Actually, last year was the first edition of the Affordability Index. So I thought he would also give us some perspective on that. And Alison Gilbert, Dr. Alison Gilbert, who has been involved for some time now through her research ICT Africa network. It's a multi-country network in Africa, now around 12 countries, but started more than 20 countries, and they have been doing a lot of work on primary data collections through household and SME survey, so demand-side analysis and supply-side as well analysis, and bringing that together to basically inform policy-making processes. So as you see, we have wealth of experience and knowledge, and I wanted to basically structure the session as a forum for discussion. So it's interesting that different people from different perspectives that work on different dynamics of measurement, the internet or the openness of the internet. And it is unique actually because usually you don't find people that are working in different angles coming together and discussing a holistic approach. Because usually you find people either talking about access, talking about content, or talking about impacts of the internet, but they don't necessarily come together in a panel to start discussing this. And the idea when we started, or when the foundation started the internet, I joined the Web Index, sorry, I joined the foundation a few months ago, is that it's not only about measuring access and universal access. We also have to understand rights and rights on the internet and how the experience of users are on the internet. We also need to understand local content. We also need to understand how it's affecting us all. And that's the idea of developing this multi-composite indicator. But let me open it to the panel of discussion. The first question I'm going to pose to you is, well, telling me a bit more about how you go about measuring the openness of the internet, the type of work you do, and how this question basically fits from your perspective.
Hi, well, thanks for the invitation and presentation. Thanks. As you mentioned, during the last year, along with a colleague of mine, Mark Ram, at the Oxford Internet Institute, we have tried to measure various various attributes of the internet, in particular concerning its geographies. So we try to understand and analyze internet data from different perspectives. The first one is obviously the accessibility of data, so where people have access to the internet, how, why do they have access to the internet. And we try to move beyond that and trying to understand how people participate, how much they participate to the internet, and as well as how well different countries are represented on the internet. So what the internet talk about in terms of geographies. And in general, what we are seeing is that there are very large differences. So in our understanding, the informational divide on the internet is even larger than the digital divide itself. And the participation and representation are a reinforcement on the digital divide. In general, this is what we have found out up until now. And I pass over the microphone, please.
Prof, do you want to speak to this question, or?
The same question? Or?
Yeah, the same question, please. If you want to speak about, for instance, the involvement, the interest of your center in data collections and your involvement with the statistical offices.
Okay.
Instance,
Khaled, thank you very much. Thank you very much also for inviting me to be part of this panel. I tell you, before I went to ministry, before I was a vice rector, I was more involved with the actual doing. And then I became a sort of policy maker. And now I decided it's better come back and do the job by myself. Because one thing is set up a policy, facilitate, the other thing is to get results. What I'm going to tell you is what I have learned from the policy side. In general, in Africa, we don't have enough statistical information in the area of ICT, in particular on the internet, or on science, technology, innovation, on entrepreneurship. On innovations also, we don't have enough information. When I say we, I mean now me and now before when I was minister, meaning that some decisions we have to make will require more accurate data. So, for instance, if you move around and you ask it, oh, how many internet users you have? The first thing we do is we run it to ITU statistics, and we say, oh yeah, this is the statistics. So in one meeting, it was very interesting. In one meeting three months ago, Khaled was, one person was saying, you know, the coverage of internet in Mozambique is it's 4.5% of the population. And the other one said, no, but it's 6%. So, and then you ask, what is the source of information? No, I saw in the ITU, I saw in that, and saw the different suppliers of information. And of course, with non-accurate data, it's also difficult for you to make the appropriate decision about some of the things you want to do. My reason and interest, again, to come back to this issue is because we would very much like to see how can we establish an entity that work with the national statistics to determine a more precise data gathering and processing and keeping updated information about what is going on. There are elements here of capacity building and technology usage for collecting information, processing and storing and making it available. So we are also looking for partnerships. The second point is I am very much convinced that all the accurate information that is made available to the decision makers will be used. Can be directly through the national statistics or through those entities that could participate on the production of the real data. So my recommendation also will be that we bring more partners to help to establish this capacity and technology to be able to generate the necessary data. Finally, in this my initial talk, a gap I have noticed very strongly. I visited OECD, I visited UNESCO, I visited all these institutions, trying to see how you make a link between these technology developments and the GDP. It has been very hard to find this link. It's very complex compared to what I think maybe would be a logical link. How, when you establish, for instance, mobile software for people to be able to sell more products, how do you use this as a contribution to the GDP? So I don't know, this is also trying to see if someone is doing something on this in terms of statistics and data that incorporate on the formula for the calculation of a GDP of the country. I think that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. You raised a few issues there that I think we'll have to come back to them, but at least the one that I noted, the proliferation of data and the quality of data, and then what perhaps the policymaker is interested in about to make his or her point is around the impacts. So we'll come back to those. Robert, your turn.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting.
I'm going to go there so I can see you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. What I'll do very quickly is I'll maybe say a little bit about kind of myself in the Citizen Lab, and then try to get to your question. You introduced me as being with the Citizen Lab. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Citizen Lab is a unique multidisciplinary research laboratory at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and we do something that's kind of unique in this space, in that we bring together experts that are familiar with the issues of ICTs, international security, and human rights. There's a variety of different activities that we do there. I'll touch on them in a moment. I'm also a member of ICANN's Security and Stability Advisory Committee, and been involved in some of the studies that they've done, or some of the reports that they've done on the consequences of internet blocking, and have been a long-time participant of the IGF and its predecessor, the World Summit on the Information Society. The Citizen Lab is one of the pioneer organizations that have been measuring internet openness, and by internet openness, it's how we see that term is kind of evolving. One measurement is, net openness is accessibility, number of users. What the Citizen Lab's been doing, and it's been evolving over time, is trying to measure for us internet openness. When we started in around 2002, we were one of the pioneering groups, together with the Berkman Center and others, that we started using research-based methods and analytical tools to basically determine the extent of censorship and blocking that was taking place around the world. There were a lot of anecdotal reports at the time from users in China and elsewhere of what was happening. What we did is we built technical tools and we collaborated with users in the country, one, to determine A, the extent of the problem, and then to do a technical interrogation to find out the nuance, the type, and from that we've seen that there's an evolution in blocking, in that it was originally a few set of countries, and it's evolved now to almost all countries in the world blocked, not just Turkey, but Canada, the US, and many others. And what we've seen is with the evolution, and I won't get into too much of the details, that it's really shifted in regard to far more extensive and advanced tools are being used by ISPs and governments around the world. Not so much censorship and blocking, but more so now targeted surveillance and digital attacks against businesses, against governments, and against least resource actors such as civil society. A lot of the work of the Citizen Lab over the last 2 years, we've studied extensively working with partners in countries using what's best described as very advanced digital forensic methods to actually analyze, one, whether the hypothesis of whether attacks are taking place, two, then trying to attribute specific commercial products that are made in Europe, Canada, and elsewhere that are being used. And what we've seen is, unfortunately, an advancement of the sophistication of the measures. And so we measure it through advanced technical measures and stuff like that. What we've also seen is particularly important now, and I think the session previous to this one touched on it, is to measure internet openness is also having a dialogue with providers to see how transparent they are in terms of throttling and other types of issues that they do. And so I would say that to get back to your question, in terms of measuring internet openness and the work that we've done and that we've published, it's available at citizenlab.org, is through research-based methods to get, I think, to one of your points, is to use research-based data to inform policy and also to inform actors in terms of what are the threats, what are the blockages, and then what are the best strategies to move forward. I'll get into more details, but I'll let others answer.
Thanks. Yassine? On more the affordability and the access-related question.
Yes, I'm pretty much new in this Alliance for Affordable Internet and Web Foundation team. I'm just starting participating into the basic data collection, or more than data, information, I would say, collection on policy regulation and the environment in which each country, the environment in which country that favors or not policy reform and regulatory reform that would lower the cost of access to internet and broadband and better penetration. So this is the Affordability Report 2013 has been released, I think, Emily, when was that? In May, March? Oh, in December. Okay. So and before the end of the year, you will have the 2014. I think the scope has been expanded. The number of countries that we're including into the affordability report has been expanded. The point there is, it's a tool both for informing, but for making decisions, for informing policymakers, and I think also it helps to identify. I mean, I've been involved lately in the process of 3 countries, interviewing people in the countries really to understand the situation. So it really helps a lot. I mean, it helps me a lot, at least, identify where are the key challenges, the key questions that change a lot from country to country. I think it's very difficult to benchmark. You can benchmark statistical data, but it's very difficult to benchmark how the law was designed 20 years ago with one that was designed 5 years ago, how the local legal system, how in countries they have 7 regulators for ICT, in countries they have 1, in countries you have to go to the judge to enforce any regulation. So it's quite difficult it's a tremendous effort to try to benchmark all this together and have some kind of index. This is a tremendous work, I think, I've been working in ICT for 20 years and trying to measure things ICT for 20 years, and the question is always, how beyond simple number of access or numbers of statistics like the ITU statistics, how many people connected, how many computers, how do you really measure the impact of all that? How can you have a sense of this is really making a social change, empowering people? It's so transversal to so many things. ICT can be used for so many things and in so many ways, and it can empower or not people. And this is very difficult to measure. That's when you see that the traditional evaluation, let's say frameworks or methodologies fail because you're not just adding up numbers. You're really looking at the process. You're really looking at empowerment. So, and that's where, for example, I was telling you this morning at breakfast, I learned with IDRC this outcome mapping methodology, and I liked it a lot because it was like really looking, I'm not looking at impacts, I'm looking just at how much people change their behavior in their day-to-day thing when we introduce or change one of the factors, and this is introducing ICT, for example, and that is very important. The other question also is for who we are doing this. Are we doing really this for who needs to be informed? Who takes decision? Not only policy makers, decision makers, but also maybe the people themselves, the organizations, the NGO, the communities. We have to think about for who we're doing this evaluation and who's the actor in the evaluation. And I know that evaluation and monitoring and data takes a lot of energy and a lot of time. And often the people who do things say, okay, I don't have time for additionally to do the thing. I have to look for the money, work the project, do this, do that. And you ask me to also evaluate and then do 10 more workshops to evaluate and understand what I'm doing at the same time. So there is a problem of resource, and of course it's a problem of understanding how important it is to measure, evaluate, and be able to look at these things. So measuring processes, measuring empowerment, measuring environment is challenging, but we're trying to do our best to produce. So I invite everybody to stay alert when the new affordability report come out, which will highlight how much policy and regulatory reform can impact access and affordability of access.
Thanks, Alison. Your turn. But I wanted you to perhaps speak about both the demand and the supply, because I think Korea has a breadth of knowledge and expertise in that. And yeah, let's start with those, how you combine the two, and then take it from there.
Okay. Khalid, I've got a few slides here, just because I think it can capture...
Do we have her slides?
Just because I think it can capture much more succinctly than me speaking for ages. But also, if you'll just give me some indication where you want me just to move on. And
not this one.
Perhaps just while they get it up, because I think Enrico
It was there. I just...
No, it wasn't that one.
No, it wasn't that one. It was mine, but I'm not using it.
I'll just speak a little bit about Research ICT Africa.
Is it measuring broadband access? Yeah? All right.
Research ICT Africa really grew out of a need for evidence on which to build evidence-based policy in Africa. I started Research ICT Africa after coming out of the regulator, the first regulator in South Africa in 1997, and having just experienced the fact that we had no indigenous data, no indigenous knowledge really about regulation. We were working with very sophisticated imported frameworks from the European Union or somewhere else that really didn't bear any relation to the maturity of our markets, the competitiveness of our markets, or the capabilities of our institutions and our regulators. So initially we just started off by trying to gather together supply-side data that was more up-to-date than the ITU data. Obviously, that was all we had, and we realized that we were now in this very dynamic mobile environment where mobile uptake was, happening exponentially, and we were dealing with data from the ITU that was 2-3 years old. What happened was that we were then working with listed companies' quarterly reports and annual reports and getting the data out more quickly. But we soon realized that there was not the regulatory regulatory oversight of the operator supply side data, and that it was actually very misinformed and misinforming. One of the earliest issues that we worked on that's now become sort of common knowledge, but we worked very closely with Learn Asia and the ITU on, was trying to understand subscriber numbers for mobile phones. So operators were giving these, at that time even magnitudes of scale larger than it appeared people were using them on the ground, and now, these sort of 125% when we all know people who don't have phones. So the issue of number of SIMs arose, and the question then was, well, how many duplicate SIMs are there? And so it really began to raise the issues of the need for demand-side research, that the only way we were really going to understand what was happening in the market was to get onto the ground, go into the field, and actually speak to people about what they were using and what they weren't using. So I think what's significant about these reports compared to a lot of the reports of this nature that are done in the developing world, and very often done with supervision from the north and people operating on the ground in the south, but sometimes a disconnect between those two, is that this research really looks not only at those who are connected, it's not only looking at the bottom of the pyramid, it's not only looking at the use of women in, Uganda, women in Uganda, in a center especially designed for women. It actually does nationally representative surveys, which can then be sliced and diced as you need the information, which can then allow for rural-urban disaggregations, can then allow for gender disaggregations. Gender disaggregations cannot be got for mobile in any other way than through demand-side research. People have argued that now with the recurring, the registration of SIM cards, it's not such a big problem anymore. Well, we all know the disaster of SIM card registration on the continent. It's taken millions of people offline, and it's really limited access for those who don't have identities, that don't have postal addresses and that kind of thing. So I have at least 6 or 7 people illegally registered on my name, and I long to be taken to court on an intelligence issue on this, so that I can expose how accessing these cards and biometrics and things that have gone with it have actually
nobody will dare
reduced access, not increased it. So this is the kind of research we were doing. Is that presentation up yet? Yes. Oh, that side. Sorry. Can I just show you some of the results of that? So I think the important thing, I think some of you have seen that John Matherley has again produced that lovely map of the world that shows he's pinged all the points on the web and shown that Africa's this big black hole, and just little spots around southern Africa, North Africa, and then of course it's lit up in the north and in parts of Asia. And our research is really trying to understand what's happening in that big dark patch, and understanding the linkages between that big dark patch in Africa and what's happening in the other parts of the world. So understanding the reasons for people's marginalization is a critical point of policy intervention if you're trying to increase access. But I think the important thing about this research is that it not only identifies lack of access. What we found, having identified issues around lack of access, was that the issues were far more complex than that. And once we moved beyond the more descriptive kind of data, which showed, for example, in relation to gender and to women, that women may or may not, in certain circumstances, have more access to certain things than men. In many countries, women have more access to mobile than men. But if you begin to look at their usage patterns, what they're expending on it, it's far more uneven. So the issues of inequality really get raised beyond access. And we see this particularly with the internet, when we begin to look at data usage and that kind of thing, is that the correlation between access and usage is really between income and education. And that it's only a gender issue because women are concentrated in lower income and lower educational groups. Sorry, I'm just talking because I can't actually get this to move on. I'm going to just quickly run through some things very, very quickly here. Just to say that importance of a household survey in order to understand the relation of communication spend, but also the importance of communication and the willingness of poor people to spend on communication is really some indication of how significant it is to their social and economic well-being. But you can see that power remains a major issue. The other point I wanted to make very, very quickly is that if we're talking about access to information, radio still remains the most important form of information on the continent. This is changing, and it will change as we get an increase in broadband. But I think the important thing here is that we need to be careful when we're sort of giving away spectrum to people, that they're actually people who, if they're not connected to broadband, are going to have nothing. Just to say the fixed lines is obviously, we're talking about mobile penetration. If we're talking about the network access, the access network, we're talking about mobile. Obviously, there are big issues around fiber, backhaul, international prices have come down, all of that's very important. If we're talking about connecting the last billion now, we're talking about mobile. We can see the limited number of people with working computers. Obviously, this has changed with the connectivity provided by mobile phones. And then I'm just going to take you very quickly, because you can look at these. This is all online and in the public domain. This research has been conducted, the demand side research, every 3 years over the last decade, due to the extraordinary support we've had from IDRC, and of course Khaled in his former life saw through the last few rounds of that. Sadly, this research in the next year will only be conducted in 3 countries, so we've gone from 20 or 17 effectively out of that round to 12 with funding cuts, and to only 3 next year. So that's very serious. But what you can see from here, for example, is that the real take-up with mobile is absolutely extraordinary, and that's really what we're going to see the similar pattern that we saw with voice. I just wanted to say, basically doing this national representative research allows you to slice and dice it in a number of ways. We see that social networks are really is what's driving take-up. If we look at, as I said, the gender data, what's really important about moving beyond the descriptive statistics is the kind of modeling that allows you to really see what the correlations are and what the linkages are to identify points of intervention. And often, it's quite depressing, because putting up a women's telecentre is not going to solve our problem in terms of gender. These are, intergenerational, long-term human development issues that need to be addressed. I want to very, very quickly, I know Khaled's wanting to move on, so I just want to very, very quickly.
I was going to stay with you, but to follow up on another questions, but if you could speak to the supply side data.
Yes.
And that's, which is this, I'm assuming,
yes.
Yeah?
Yes. So having worked on the simply the access supply side data, what became apparent, as I said very quickly, is that in terms of stimulating demand, pricing was one of the critical issues, and that the pricing, particularly mobile pricing, was particularly opaque in Africa. We started off doing prepaid mobile voice indices, and the one point I want to quickly make about indices, seeing it is your web index panel, is that I think one needs to think about the value and the purpose of indices. So, for example, with this work, we've also done a telecommunication regulatory environment survey, which is a perception survey of operators, and basically it uses the main 5 agreed WTO categories, so, and including universal service, but tariffs, universal service, spectrum, resources, etc. And then civil society, operators, everybody except the regulator and government, because it's about the regulatory environment, are able to assess across these categories. Now, when we originally started doing it, the purpose was it was a kind of moral suasion thing. If we could show that countries were being poorly perceived in terms of regulatory input, regulatory effectiveness, then we could challenge them. But in fact, because these things are so at the national level, so nuanced, we found that the study is actually far more interesting longitudinally for a country at the national level to see the progress it's making in universal service, in spectrum. Now it's come back on interconnection and competitive issues, etc., then compare them against each other. In South Africa, we have a very, very critical and vibrant vibrant and challenging environment. Everybody criticizes everything, and South Africa scores very, very poorly. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can compare it with another environment where there's less criticism. So perception surveys need to be understood and used very, very carefully. The supply side stuff here, we've now moved into broadband. This has been a real challenge because of the complete bundling and integration of voice and data, which makes it very difficult to assess exactly how many data users there are. And then secondly, to deal with the issues of prices. So for example, in Egypt, which right throughout the political crises has continued to have extraordinarily dynamic pricing products, etc., you just can buy airtime and you make up voice and data, whatever you want with that. So it's not even that operators in advance know what they're selling and what they're getting back.
Yeah.
But just to qualify this basket of thing, the pricing issue, we had put up several indices, and we found that a country like Cameroon, for example, was the cheapest country of the, at that point, I think Enrico was about 15, 17 that we were looking at. And we then went to look at that and say, what is Cameroon doing right that it's so cheap? What we found, that it was these poor operators who'd been sort of blocked in their evolution on 2.5 GSM, 2.5 standard edge basic quality, were offering essentially sort of dial-up quality because the 3G license had been granted as a monopoly to Viatel and essentially not become operational. So Cameroon had just sort of fallen back after being one of the leading internet countries, I should say, in terms of aggregated access. Yeah. It fell back entirely. So the qualification of these pricing and things really make a difference, because otherwise the evidence is not accurate. And the major qualification, and this is the last point I'll make on this, is that we've now taken this pricing data and looked at it against the quality of service data. At the moment, outside of South Africa, this is just Ookla data, but in South Africa, it's actually router-based testing. And we found that some of the prices that are a little bit higher in certain countries are actually for much greater quality. So from a value for money point of view, much greater speeds, much better throughputs. Of course, we all have latency problems because we're all going through London and whatnot. But the actual price, on a pure price basis index, is really misinformative, not informative. So I just wanted to say this is the kind of research that's being done, and it's all in the public domain. And the databases for researchers are also available, but they require a little more coordination on our part. And we're very lean and mean on the ground. So it does require us to give us some time to allow us to work with you with that data.
It's a nice segue of my next question, and basically because you started to talk about the challenges and the methodological challenges and what the type of sort of indicator that you could combine or not combine for what purposes and so forth. And that's actually specifically I wanted to ask, perhaps Robert, if you could take it off from here, in terms of the challenges that you're facing at the Center for this, to collect this type of data, this type of information, both methodologically and also in terms of supporting the capacity development on the ground, because you don't do necessarily all the collection yourself, but you're basically collaborating with partners. I would love to hear more of that, and if anyone wants to jump in on this, then I'll give them the floor. And sorry, and if you have any follow-up question, I'll give you the floor after this.
So just something that I forgot to mention earlier, some of the work that I'd mentioned earlier in regards to internet blocking and censorship was published under a study or a collaboration that we did with the Berkman Center called the OpenNet Initiative. And if you just Google that online, there are 3 publications that we put out over, I think it was 6 different years, in a variety of different countries, and so that's online as well. I think for challenges, it's a hard question. I'll maybe try to tackle it in different points. First of all, is for some of the research that we do, we're just lucky that we have partnerships in particular country. It's a trusted relationship that's required, particularly some of I'll get into that into a bit more. 2 is the ethics and the protocols that we use. Yeah. We've developed them, but it's different if you're measuring kind of broadband measurements, network measurements. But if you're trying to measure internet blocking from a particular country or those type of issues, as a researcher, you get access to a lot of the user data. And so one of the things that we've done a little bit differently than many of the others is we actually have a formal, we go through ethics approval at the university, and we enter into a formal kind of relationship in terms of what gets collected, who on the team actually has different access to information, and going through that very rigorous approach that takes a lot of time but is particularly important. And we've shared that as well too. When I said in terms of challenges, where to get the information, I think we've had a lot of, I guess, we've just been lucky that we've had relationships. For example, one of our earlier publications that got a lot of media attention, which was related to malware that was affecting Chinese groups around the world, was really thanks to a very special relationship that we had with the Office of the Dalai Lama and Dharamsala. And so if you want to have that type of relationship with different types of groups, it's a trusted relationship where you're a steward of their data and can work with them and their researchers. What we see in some of our results then, if you then want to go towards more a global pattern or a regional pattern, is developing those type of trusted relationship and building them up in other parts of the world. That takes a lot of time. Where we are kind of now is that we have a lot of expertise and research that we've done in Asia, in the Middle East. As I was commenting before we started, it's been more of a challenge in regards to finding some of the technical researchers that we can work with in groups on the ground in Africa and particularly Latin America. So when we talk about that, we see a pattern of increased digital attacks against organizations around the world. It's hard, we don't want to generalize. All we can say is that, and then we get questions from different parts. And so I think it's it's also the retention of staff that will have very special and unique skills that can get, I would say, orders of magnitude more funding if they worked in the commercial or private sector. So finding and recruiting that. Two, maintaining a real diverse intersection of both the technical and the non-technical on the team. And something that we do, and I won't get into the funding issue, but it's more how we can share our data with the community. And so a lot of times we have put out all the data for the OpenEd initiative. It sits there, but not necessarily a lot of groups are using it. And so trying to encourage the data that has been shared and the frameworks for others to try to replicate our work as well too. It's very sophisticated and things like that. And so just to finish up in terms of the challenges, I think it's trying to develop, for at the IGF, I think it's some of the work that we do affects a particular sector, but actually affects the whole internet ecosystem, and trying to find other actors like the private sector and governments to be equally interested. And that has been our big challenge in Canada, though we're one of the leaders in Canada on this issue, to try to get companies interested and to get the Canadian government interested is a big challenge. And so, we think it's an issue of concern, and getting the attention of those that make policy is crucial.
Thanks. You had a question.
First of all, thank you for your interesting presentations. I have a couple of questions. My first question is, what are the primary recipients of your data collection and evaluation efforts, like policymakers, regulators, researchers? Have you seen any cases where the regulators used your data for their market analysis work, for example? And finally, my last question to Alison, your cross-country comparisons in terms of price and quality of service benchmarks. Have you seen the cases where consumer organizations use this to lobby for consumer rights issues? Because that's an issue, for example, in my country, where consumers are not continuously complaining about the quality of broadband service they get from the operators, and this might be a very useful data resource for them to lobby in front of the operators and the regulator itself to improve the quality of service. Thank you.
Alison or Robert or whoever wants to jump in. I don't know which one to use now.
Just to know which country.
I come from Armenia, and I'm heading a civil society organization, and simultaneously I'm an ICT consultant.
Perhaps if I can pick up on his questions on and what you said, Robert, on how to communicate to Canadian government and policymakers, if you can speak about the strategies that you use to get your message out there, simplify these data and indices and so forth, and have them in a more user-friendly way, if at all, or other type of strategy that you have looked at. Sure, go ahead.
Let me go first. I think in terms of just getting to your question, I think directly is there are multiple recipients of the information reports that we do. First of all, we publish in the traditional academic sense in terms of peer-reviewed journals, and inform and actually organize seminars and events quite often. What's different in a lot of the work that we do too is we actually, most of our reports actually over the last 2 years have been of considerable interest to the mainstream media, and we have, I can't count right now the number of above-the-fold articles that we've published or reports that we've published that have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and press around the world. And so, and it's working, I guess, with and having media contacts, getting to your question as well too, who can take what can be a very technical report and have not necessarily the staff in Toronto, but some of the researchers and some of the partners of the ground be able to speak to the media to basically have the impact of the changing landscape of internet controls that are taking place. And what we believe is that the effects of our reports, what they've also, not just the recipients, but what they've been able to do, while some governments may or may not be listening, there is definitely communities that are trying to support certain communities, human rights defenders and others, have their groups be safer online. And what's very important there are assumptions of what the risks and threats are. And what we think is that our data and the research that we do actually are evidence-based data on the actual threats and issues that are taking place, and then that's helping the donors in the space tailor their programs that they're supporting, the organizations that are doing these type of projects either change their approach, and I think more generally kind of what we've seen, and I mentioned earlier, what we've seen is that the sophistication of the issues that are being faced, it's not just about having fast broadband in a particular country, but if users then want to partake in particular type of activities that may have sensitive or other types of information, we don't necessarily do advocacy ourselves, but what other groups have done have taken our data and used it for advocacy campaigns to help educate users in terms of the options, the risks that they do. So I'm not sure here in Turkey, but in Mexico, and for example, some of our reports have actually triggered legal proceedings against companies or governments. And so the recipients are the public, but we try to do it in a very vigorous way so it could be used by a variety of those that wish to advocate, but using the technical data that's there.
Do you want to respond, Alison, as well?
Thank you. I think perhaps I'm in the fortunate position of having just undergone, or the unfortunate perhaps, of having just undergone an extremely rigorous independent review of 10 years of funding by IDRC, which was actually, interestingly, for those of you interested in evaluation, commissioned by Khaled originally, as a major research project to try and establish a sort of the theory of change that underpinned our apparent success in terms of dissemination, in terms of policy influence. So the whole evaluation is done as a research to policy influence analysis. And when we first started this project in terms of trying to get funding from a number of different aid groups, people really expected demonstration of a silver bullet. Like, we you gave us this money, we went and did this, and boom, there you are. And I think the most significant thing about the report, which was done by DESI on behalf of IDRC, was the demonstration that it was the consolidation of work, of outputs, of credible outputs over a decade that has allowed us to become more effective and to withstand criticism from operators or governments or wherever the people don't like that research. So I think, and as I say, I can say this because this is not my doing. This is, I think what distinguishes our work compared to some of the global work that's done is that it's done it's done locally, on the ground, by people from universities or research institutions, etc., on the ground. So they have a very good understanding of what's going on. And in that degree, it's reasonably uneven as well, because those different individuals are more embedded in the politics or influence within those different countries, and so have different success. But I think the hallmark to it all is that it's independent, rigorous, defensible research. And in this way, it has informed, been publicly cited and used as evidence for a number of policy processes. Perhaps just to highlight one, because it's been very close to a silver bullet for us, is the work we've done on mobile termination rate reductions across the main countries that have done it in Africa, and the effect on retail prices, the dramatic cut in retail prices. And this was really turned the conventional wisdom of mobile termination regulation from Europe on its head. We were able to demonstrate without any exception that a reduction in mobile termination rates did not produce the waterbed effect that operators claimed, that retail prices didn't go up in any jurisdiction at any time ever. On the contrary, you actually got an expansion of subscribers. Sometimes the incumbents' revenues actually went up from termination rate, but just because of the traffic going through the networks. Sometimes they went down, but basically, a real win-win for everybody. So that was really only possible because of our mobile termination rate data collection on the ground, because often it's not put onto the web, it's not, people aren't aware of these processes, etc. So it's getting our local people on the ground to give us constantly developments in terms of mobile termination rates, and then linking that to this extraordinarily resource-intensive and terribly dreary data collection, which Enrico has been leading for us over a period of time, collecting all all product across all countries quarterly from all operators. Now that takes me to, so I just wanted to say that being able to use that pricing data has allowed us to act as a friend of Parliament for parliamentary hearings on the cost of communication, because the parliamentary committees simply don't have the expertise or whatever to develop questions or to provide some counterpoint to the stakeholders that have been coming before them, and to quote the South African Parliamentary Portfolio Committee head, lying to us for a decade about what's actually happening with pricing and the cost of communications. So there have been some really interesting interventions. Just on your consumer point, because I think lots of people have used it, there's advocacy examples, etc. We have an enormous challenge in Africa with consumer awareness and that. Even our regulators, a lot of our regulators, will say, my job is to ensure that there's competition and investment in the country. And people will have a long thing, they'll never say, my job is actually consumer welfare, and to do this, I'm trying to ensure that there's competition and whatever. They're often not mentioned at all. So, and there is no ethos of that, there's very little ethos of that. We did try to sell a Excel-based mechanism, because people don't really want to know whether the country that they live in is 10th or 40th on an index. They want to know what package they must buy for their needs. So we tried to put up a sort of basic Excel thing that consumers could use and give it to, in this case, the South African regulator, the Namibian regulator as well, so that they could put it up on their website and possibly do some analysis on it that would assist consumers, because quite honestly, you need a PhD to work a lot of this stuff out. So, but basically, they're resource constrained. They're not really interested, and are concerned about the liability issues, the accuracy of the data, and if people actually get into contracts, that whatever. So it is a big challenge for us, and probably an area that has not, we maybe just haven't pushed hard enough on.
I'll go to. Did anyone want to address this question? Stefano, did you want to respond? I'll finish the response and then I'll come back to you. Did you want to use your slides now, or? Could you put the slides for Stefano, please? Because I know you have visualizations that you want to share.
As Calvin was mentioning, my expertise is being also in. Can I get the? Thanks. As being also trying to communicate this kind of information and outcomes of our research to the broad public. And given my background, I really think that using visualizations is an effective way to communicate, especially to the public. If you want to communicate with experts, then it's slightly different. But I think for the broad public, visualization it's more effective, as it's usually people don't like to look at tables and numbers. However, especially in the West, we are usually visually overstimulated. So a simple graph or a bar chart is usually not very attractive. So what we are trying to do is to develop, let's see if I can manage to try to develop more customized visualization. So for instance, this is a cartogram which shows the internet population as detailed by the World Bank in 2011. So each country is resized by the number of internet users, and the color tried to represent the percentage. And you can clearly see how Africa almost disappeared and how China is basically 1/3 of, or 20% of the overall population here, and how distribution of the color is centralized in Europe and North America. So we try to use these visuals to better communicate information. And I would like to also jump back to one of the issues that being raised. So trying to go beyond what are the institutional channels and the national statistics, and try to collect other data. Well, for instance, this is just a mix of two institutional channels. So here we are mixing the broadband cost from the ITU and the gross national income per capita from the World Bank, just to try to see how affordable is the internet in terms of cost for the population. But in our research, my colleague and I are trying to really go on the ground in another sense, and trying to go really on the internet and try to collect data there rather than from institutional channels or on the ground, as many other projects are doing. And in a future project, we're trying actually to go on both grounds, so on the internet and on the ground, and try to combine these two these two understandings. And so, for instance, we collected data. For instance, this is GitHub, which is the leading website for collaborative software, so try to share your software. And even accounting for the internet population of a country, not the general population, we see, as I said before, how the informational divide and the production divide is far larger than the digital divide itself. So we can see that most of the content is produced in the US, in Europe, even considering the large population, and little is being produced in Africa, for instance, unfortunately. Here, going back to the visualization and looking more carefully, you can see the two globes are surrounded by a pie chart, which represents the number of users and the number of uploads per country. So here we're trying to add more informational standards, so you can have one overview at the first look, and then go more into detail. And if I can show just one more slide, for instance, this is the geographic coverage of Wikipedia, which is well understood as the central hub for knowledge discovery for most people on the internet. And as you can see, the informational divide here, the representational divide is enormous, and most of the content is about about Europe. Most content is centered in Europe, over 50%. And I think that this kind of visualization can strike really the general public, and these also connect to a principle which has been suggested by some of my colleagues in a recent paper, which is the principle of growing information poverty, where the content that is on the internet leads to the creation of further content. So if we have content about Europe, this leads to the creation of more content about Europe because of remixing of the data, because of translations. Like, for instance, you can see France, there are a lot of content about France because content about France has been translated, sometimes automatically, in many other languages. So we have a lot of content about France for that reason. And nice. I think this is a good way to communicate, at least to the broad public.
Thanks. Yassine, you wanted to respond as well? And then, yeah.
Okay, for the use of the data, it's interesting, I mean, on the research, or it's interesting, the question also that was asked about how do I link, for example, how do I link this very basic telecom or access indicators with GDP, or with wellness, or with the how the social or economic situation of the individuals. It's quite a complex question, and I've been reading in the plane coming here an information book published by IDRC, the Information Life of the Poor, and I think there are several intents. I think you collaborated probably with that. I must say that I was surprised to see several studies or several outcomes of this research linking that. So this is for policymakers and for people who do advocacy. Now, if you want to go to the broader public, you would look, for example, there was another IDRC-funded project in Uruguay like a few years ago about how to use a social network to get this research, pure research data and outputs, and use it for mass communication and influencing public opinion, like it was done in Mexico when the regulator was about to change some regulation and that would have give more market to the incumbent, in fact. And thanks to the use of social media and to a piece of research that was clearly demonstrating facts with hard data, they were able to influence sufficiently the public, through Twitter and whatever, and Facebook and all these things, so that the government had to step back, or the parliament had to step back on that measure or that law, something like that. So there are many ways of using the research and being able to do reality change, to change reality directly through public opinion, or to inform policymakers with evidence and facts that they can convince them to change it. So it's very important. Often researchers we're focused on research, that's what we do, but we have to ally in the team with communicators and people who are able to translate that. And nice graphics are always important and very effective. I think visualization graphics that you can easily put on newspapers, on Facebook, on whatever, are quite important if you know well how to produce them.
Thanks.
Oh, just one thing, just one small thing I want to throw is the data from the operators. I think for me is the most critical things I don't see. How the operators must know what the people use, how they use it, how much they use this, how many time they spend, how many hours a day they spend on this and that. And they can cross that with their profiles, because they have the profiles. They know the gender, they know the age, they probably know the kind of, if it's a private or a business or something. So there is I think a universe of data here that we're not really having access to, right? Okay. Yeah, but from the operators themselves, I think that will be a wonderful thing to have.
Yes, Walid Al-Sakaf, a researcher at Erbil University in Sweden, but I'm from Yemen. And ironically enough, at the Web Index, Sweden tops the list and Yemen is at the very bottom. So I have a spectrum of view of what lies, what the challenges lie ahead. Let me say it's rather important that we understand there's a huge gap between countries. and I've seen this firsthand by living there and also living there. And there should be more initiatives, and I take this opportunity on the record to appreciate what the University of Toronto is doing through the Cyber Stewards Program, a program bringing activists, which and researchers and people involved in the internet from different parts of the world to work together and introducing research and ideas that could bridge the gap. However, I think that we still need more of this, and while there is also research such as the OpenNet initiative that was pioneering, in fact it was a very solid part that I referred to in my PhD, is that we need more researchers on the ground in developing countries, and one ambitious idea is to perhaps build bridges of understanding, collaboration around those barometric data, around the research that you've gotten, and put a solid case for donor institutions and people who have money to tell them, look, we are indeed in deficit in those areas, and those are the regions that we need to cover. So let us have a priority in presenting projects from those countries so they can get funding, because I often see funding coming and going to people who live in the developed world and are engaged in developed countries and universities, which is okay, great, but at the same time it increases the gap often and results in more and more people, and let's say adds and multiplies to the digital divide in the academic circles. One problem that arises often is the language gap, and that is in the Arab world one of the predominantly biggest problems. So what I had what I believe is a possible solution is to connect to the networks of Arab academics. And that's one suggestion that I'm throwing at you to see if you can react to that and see if there's a way to create a network between academics in developed countries with those in regions such as the Arab world. So I'd love to get your views on that.
I have some thoughts on that, but I'll ask, because networking and capacity developing has been quite some of my passion and involvement over the past few years, but I'll hold on since I'm facilitating the discussion. I'll ask first Prof. Because I think this question is very relevant in your context, and you're a great example of the effort that you've made working with young entrepreneurs, students coming out, giving them opportunities, going out there and seeking fundings. So tell us more about your experience in Mozambique. And by the way, I told you that I'm going to ask you this. When you were a minister, were all these researchers coming to you and the data, were you using data really, or the decisions were already made and you just used it? So tell us more about that too.
Khaled said, I will ask you this question. So I see he's a man of promise. When I promise, he asks. But I also promise you to answer, so I will answer
Thank
now.
you.
The first part of your question, I would not agree more than what I didn't write the name, but Walid said. I think this man has got half Mozambique and so I can speak. You know what? For me, it's very impressive when I see these graphs here. And they paint Mozambique with very dark red, and to say that 100%, I don't know, what is this? No, it's not for you to explain to me. That should be self-explanatory, not only for me, but for the locals over there who are on dire need of using this information. So maybe, I'm sure now we become friends, so maybe it will be good we investigate the possibility of twinning initiatives, I don't know, or joining efforts, because they mimic the language, the culture, the habits, also influence these numbers. And strengthening the local institutions to work with, I think this will be a very good contribution. So I'm just provoking my new friend here, and Dr. Allen, we have been discussing. Sometimes I run away when I become minister, but now I am back, so it's very serious, the issue of, and what Khaled was saying is that my model of development is always I rely on the youth and the young people. Because if you look at the statistics, you see the youth are the majority in Africa, in developing countries. And there is a very high pressure to give them opportunity to get university degree. But if they don't create their own business, or business alike, they will wait to be employed, then you create a new problem for the continent. So training them to become entrepreneurs, being able to do the job, like my friend is doing, consultant. So you create your own business. I think this is very, very important for them. I failed a bit in this. I became 50 without my own business, but one day I will start. I'm still young. Okay, yeah, I hope I will start. But I failed. I'm not a good example for them. But I always tell them, do something by yourself. And this is a good field because it's very green. And you don't have the fight off. And you can use a lot of technology that they handle easily to collect data and make information available. So yes, I think we have to promote more of this partnership and see the linkages between, for instance, I have different heads now. I am for AI, I am Harvard University, I am different heads. But I think we need more of such linkages with other institutions. I promised to answer the question about the statistics, but I will give you a trick. There's a very important trick.
Yes.
Make sure that the graphs that my sister has shown, you pick 5 bullets and you give it to the minister. Mm-hmm. Don't give all the graphs, 5 bullets. Because we are overloaded with a lot of documents and information. So you may have the perception that, at this level, people do not want to use. But it's because there's too much information. So if you open 1 page, second introduction, and okay, I will read this later on. And then, of course, it became a problem. But if you have a card, something very simple, small one that gives you the summary or the relevant of the topic that must be tackled, definitely you will see this being consumed at very high level. But on the other hand, this is the trick I want to give you. Very few ministers sit down and write it themselves. You have the assistant. So we have to establish a strategy that allow the assistant to get that information and make use of. Sometimes you may have the most updated information, very well qualified. But if my strategic international advisor doesn't read that, you don't give him to read, be sure will not be use it, even if he's very good. He or she will use what she get access. So I think must be a strategy to see how can we make this information floating at the levels that allow the decision makers to make a decision. This is valid at the heads of state level, is valid at the ministry level, it's valid. But the directors, the assistants are the ones who should be more and more, I may provoke, but in the studies, what Francisco has written, if a director asks something, he will copy that and give it to rector. It's a good strategy because he knows it's him who produced it, participated, etc. I promise to answer. Okay.
You did. Thank you. Reaction? Yeah, go ahead. Yassine, yeah?
Yes, just very quick. So now, just a comment on what the professor said here. It's a matter of trust then. There is a matter of trusting, and once you trust the source and you trust the process, I mean, if there's a decision making, they would take what you bring on the table more easily. The other thing is about capacity building and researchers on the ground. What is the reality is that whenever you train people on the ground in developing countries and they reach a certain level of efficiency, quality things, immediately international organizations, big NGOs, and other people will take them. And they will move to the north. So the problem is how, I mean, it's not enough to train capacity, I mean, to build capacity, to train people to do research on the ground. You have also to provide somehow, I don't know, the institutional, economical, and whatever conditions needed so they stay there and they don't just move to Geneva, New York, Washington, or the next thing.
Alison.
Thank you very much for that. I was actually going to say that we can provide a very good case study for one of the examples you were looking for in Mozambique, where we've worked with our partner for 10 years, just after Venancio left the university, but with his protégés in his think tank there. And very much, I think the thing is about tailoring the data to the particular needs. So, I mean, basically what we do is we produce the initial analysis and research, and we take it into communication policy academic meetings, and we actually test the rigor and get the critique at that level. And then we take that essentially academic paper and we turn it into a policy paper. This can be anything between 25 and 60 pages, depending on what it is. And that policy paper gets sent to the strategic advisor, the researcher, whoever it is. What we take from that then is a 2 to 4 page policy brief, which just highlights either executive summary or elements of the study that we want, and we turn into a number of policy briefs. And we found that to be very effective. And we use those policy briefs also for the media, just to go back to the importance of the media. And very often what will happen in some countries is that the minister will call and say, I've read in the media that this and this, why haven't you? And you say, well, we actually sent you a pre-issue, before we sent the media, but it's sitting on your desk and you haven't bothered to read it. When it was your advisor. And so that, it can really, they can inform each other, and people can go back, and then the actual researchers come back and say, where's that fabulous data that produced that policy brief or that academic paper, and can we use it? And again, the main people who are using that public data, funded from public funds, is universities in the north, Harvard, Ivy League universities there, well-known universities in Europe that are in a position to pick up those databases and use them, and which of course is wonderful because they open them up. But a big part of this research project, which I think was why Khaled was wanting to speak, is that the project's mandate was also to build research capacity amongst the network, which was very uneven. And I think there's just extraordinary value in the evolution and development of indigenous knowledge and local intellectuals and local researchers. And the final point I wanted to just make is that we work with, our networks, and our twinning does not only have to be with universities of the north and south. In fact, our network started out as exactly that, as a university network, a network based in the London School of Economics, Delft University, and Aalborg in its previous form, and then in Africa and Asia. And what happened was that the African, Asian, and Latin American networks, all funded by IDRC, began sharing their research, sharing their methodology, and produced the kind of book that you saw, which was an outcome of those kinds of research. So it triggered that research. And I just want sorry, I said that was the last point. There's one small other point I wanted to say. It's taking that research and rigor and whatever, and then taking the next step to creating indigenous policy intellectuals, people who can actually push the boundaries of research, of policy agendas, who can engage in an informed way in public processes against stakeholders, operators, etc., to provide alternative viewpoints, and also to try and build a contestation and a debate amongst these policy intellectuals. Regulators in the US, FCC, have contending intellectuals making their own policy more rigorous and informed. We're lucky if we can get sort of, half a person and a dog to a public hearing. So it's about really that evolution, that intellectual evolution, and claiming that space as indigenous and local intellectuals. That's not to say we cut ourselves off from the North or anything else, of course not, but to engage in a more even
Stefano and then Robert, because wanted also to. Are there any other questions, by the way? No. Okay. Stefano.
Thanks. Just in terms of sharing and using the data, I think there are, well, first of all, there is one, I think, very important issue with content, especially from the global south, and which is Wikipedia is a very good example, I think, and is that most of traditions and how to say their culture in many places, even like very local culture in Europe, for instance, in my region, is on an oral tradition, and this is very problematic in terms of the internet, because most of the times what you want to do is to refer to publications, you want to refer to books, and this gets problematic when you don't have references, and this kind of problem have a big impact on the internet, where oral cultures, for instance, are very much underrepresented because they don't have, and this has very, very big impact because we are reproducing our own Britain, European, and North American culture, and we are getting to ignore more and more all the other traditions. And going back to the sharing the data, and I think there are also a few very technical things which can help a lot in remixing the data. And for instance, taking care of versioning. For instance, the World Bank doesn't use any version control. So they update the data, they update the historical data.
What do you mean by versioning control?
So for instance, if you go now and download internet penetration rates from the World Bank, they are not the same one they had for 2011. If you download now data for 2011, they are not the same data that I downloaded 2 years ago about 2011, because they update their information, but they don't tell us, they don't say it anywhere, and you don't know. If they don't have information on a country now, you don't know whether it will become available. So there is no way to reference data in this way. And another problem, for instance, is a very simple thing is using ISO codes, which makes life much, much, much easier when you have to mix different data sets. For instance, the web index doesn't has the name of the country, but doesn't have an ISO code, which means that if I want to merge that information with other information I have to manually add the ISO codes and then match the information, which can be very problematic and can take just hours away. And if you multiply that for all the researchers around the world that have to do this job, is just a waste of time where you can
Actually, it's very good that you said that now, because we're trying to recurate the data. So I would love to follow up on this conversation over the next couple of months. Yeah. So I would love to follow up on the conversation. Yeah. Robert.
I just wanted maybe to comment what Alison mentioned, and I maybe would to frame it slightly different. I think there's a need and evolution of champions on the issues, and so a lot of times, whether it's for internet openness or other issues, champions that emerge that rally the community, whether it's they have policy expertise, but they then mobilize conversation around the topic, mobilize the media, and I think others, and sometimes it's easy, but it does require a lot of other skills for the individuals to have, and sometimes one of the biggest challenges, I guess, going back is that if you're the director of our center, but many others too, is that if you have a very good report in a publication, and we've had ones that have appeared in the major media, sometimes we actually don't want to appear in the media. We prefer other people to do it because the amount of time, energy, and effort that media interviews can take you away from your research. And so trying to balance who can represent the report sometimes is a big challenge. I wanted to get, and then finish touching on something that Walid mentioned, which I think is for maybe the younger researchers or the newer researchers. Sometimes it's a challenge breaking into the existing communities. I mean, finding opportunities. I mean, coming to a meeting like this, maybe people here will meet experts that are here and be able to do that. I just don't. I think it would be better to document what these communities are working on, that they don't stay between walled gardens of donors and stuff like that. And if it's not already done, ways that people can identify and easily communicate with them, because then you can see, oh, I'm working from this, I'm in Yemen, and if you could very quickly see, well, in these type of issues, there's someone else in Mozambique or another part of Africa, you might be inclined to either write them or find others that can introduce you. And I think that threshold to try to create that network sometimes is because of a donor. And I think there should be other easier entrees to connect researchers from different regions.
Thank you. Any other questions? No question. We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask a last question. Prof. Robert, I wanted to ask a last question. We're running out of time because I think it's important to discuss it before we leave. And you brought it up, Robert, is the issue of funding. So, and my experience with Research ICT Africa in the past, even now with the Web Index, it's not necessarily easy to attract or get donors' interest in this type of work. Indicators work around collecting the data around the openness and developing policies, etc., or analyzing the data to informing policy making is not an easy space. What are your thoughts, your opinions on that? Any models that you've thought of? And perhaps one sentence each or 2 sentences each for whoever wants to jump in. Go ahead.
It's one of the resolve issues of the World Summit on the Information Society. So one of the things that created the IGF was that very issue. This was all created because of the digital divide back when, and I think it's finding ways to, one, do that. Two, there seems to have been more time, energy been spent at this conference talking about support for the IGF itself than perhaps for a lot of the different work. So it would have been nice, and if there's a recommendation going forward, there should be maybe a donor session talking about these challenges at a next meeting, because then people could actually talk about them. And I mentioned earlier that the media take a lot of time, energy, and effort away from research. I don't want to tell you what grant writing and going and accessing donors takes away time from research as well. And I think that the private sector and others, this is something that some of the intermediaries might be able to do. And the other thing is the duration of funding. I think some donors are good for multi-year funding, and some of them, the funding cycles are so short that basically you're really doing what the donor wants you to do as opposed to where the research is there. And so...
and filling in the log frame.
I think... I think there's just, it's an unresolved challenge, and I'm not an economist or others, but I think definitely there should be more attention at spaces like this in terms of how the ecosystem of the number of companies involved. It's a multi-billion-dollar space. And for just a very small amount of donors being able to support the research, something's wrong there, and then there should be other ideas. I won't propose them, but there should be more in this space. There should be far more funding.
Do you wanna? Yeah.
Khaled, I think you know that a sentence on this question is very, very difficult. But I think there is a dissertation in the political economy of funding. And I think very often the funding issues are kind of reduced to purely sort of monetary terms without the implications of political agendas, of the impact of the commercialization and the commodification of data, often in the name of self-sufficiency, and those kinds of things are really, really serious. And again, I'm probably going to say something that's quite unpopular because people are all trying to get funds and work together and feel warm and fuzzy together. But I think the effects of the global recession, together with the coincidence of conservative governments in many of the countries of the North, and the drying up of traditional funding of work that came out of a long development research trajectory, has had very severe implications for the sector. I think in many countries in the North, because in Africa there's very little state funding to do research. Some of the bigger economies like South Africa and that have very big research councils and that kind of thing. And there are also political dimensions to that. I mean, the political economy research councils as opposed to independent university research is very, very important too. But the funding cuts from traditionally progressive donor agencies not driving their own donor agenda and not trying to get donor aid back to the country of origin has had very severe implications. So there's been an enormous cutback in funding of work in sort of ICT4D, particularly in its broadest context, which includes the policy work and work that we're doing, but also in universities in the North that have traditionally received funding, aid to do development work, gender work, etc., has been cut back entirely. And those agencies that have traditionally funded, American aid agencies that have traditionally funded big universities in the US, are funding instead massive, profitable, multi-million dollar industry associations to go out and do, quite honestly, very questionable research, questionable quality of research, that essentially has a market agenda, is essentially market research, is about opening up new markets in the developing world. And that is because of the patrons that they have, the Secretary of State or Cherry Blair Fund, whatever it is, actually become the definitive reference point for our multilateral agencies. So suddenly people are speaking about, a Women on the Web report that's by some big multinational company called a global report with 5 or 6 countries actually examined and a total global sample of a couple of thousand or 6,000, I think it was, as this is now our data because there's no other data, there's no other competing data. So I think the impact of the recession, the conservative cutbacks that have come because of conservative governments in traditionally progressive or supportive countries has really had a severe impact. And I think it raises the question, with the kind of research and the reference points it has, whether poor evidence, poor information is in fact better than no information at all. Whether we're actually better off or whether we're not worse off because of the poor quality of evidence that policymakers are getting.
Thank you for that. We'll continue the discussion over a drink because we didn't finish here. But I wanted to thank you for coming, for accepting the invitation. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining the session. And I think this is the last session of the IGF, so please go and enjoy Istanbul. Here you go. Thank you. Let's show the closing as well, yes. I need to follow follow up with you on that.
Yeah.
Because I don't